Well, hello and good afternoon and welcome to our next CMD webinar. My name's Tim Fergusson. I work at the ministries team at the Baptist Union, and this is a third in a series of monthly webinars aimed at supporting our continuing ministerial development. If you ever miss one of the recordings, by the way, each monthly webinar will be on the Baptist Together website, and you can access all the details about CMD, the webinars and other things on our CMD webpage, which is up there on the screen for the address. As usual, just a quick advert for what's coming up. So the next webinar on the 13th of January is a particularly important one, actually, in helping us understand the process of CMD. Hopefully you will know that we're each asked as ministers to submit our ministry to review at least once every 3 years. For those of us who don't have a formal appraisal process in place, we're recommending the use of a tool called a 360-degree review. And making the most of this type of review is going to be the topic for January's webinar. And I'll be joined by Paul Cheeseman from Agape and its parent organisation, Campus Crusade. They're an organisation that uses this tool globally for its staff. And further ahead, in your diary, if you want, do put to the 10th of February when Sue Clements-Jury will be joining us, and we're going to be exploring the topic of pastoral supervision. So that's what's coming up. But today we're concentrating on the CMD habit of learning. And we're going to look at the question, how do I choose what to read? And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Helen Paynter from Bristol Baptist College. Helen is a coordinator of Theological Education there. So Helen, welcome to our webinar.
Thank you.
And Helen, I know that you've got another specific role at Bristol as a centre director. I just wondered whether, before we get into the topic of today, whether you just tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so 2 years ago, I set up something called the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, which is hosted within Bristol Baptist College. It's a postgraduate research centre that looks at interpretation of biblical violence, but also how the Bible is used in a violent world. But also we try and produce resources to help the churches in these areas as well. So that's a particular passion of mine.
Okay, and I will be mentioning one of those resources a bit later on in this afternoon. So let's look at this topic then, Helen. Thank you so much for kind of agreeing to tackle it. How do I choose what to read? We have to keep fresh theologically as ministers and not lean, that classic mistake of leaning on the resources that we learnt when we were at training. But the field is enormous if we're thinking about what we're going to go to for our theological learning. So where do we begin? And do we just pick up what comes to hand, or should we plan our reading? Maybe that could be a first question for us.
I think to some extent that depends on our personality. Some people really like to be very planned. Other people will just enjoy serendipity. I think there's place for both. I think there's a place for thinking, this year I'm going to read, I don't know, a good theological book and a good book that engages with wider society, or have a kind of a target for the year or something. But I do like serendipity. I think there's something really. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's sort of tracking on from something else you've read that leads you in that direction, or something that you just catch a glimpse of on social media, or something you're watching, or you just want to follow up on something, or conversation. I quite like being, we can spiritualize that and call it being open to the Spirit, and I'm sure the Spirit can lead that way. So I would say a bit of both, and maybe play to your strengths, but yeah, be open to the spontaneous as well.
Okay, I mean, if we want to plan something a bit more definite, maybe looking into a particular theme, or just feeling that we are a bit narrow in what we're doing. I mean, how do we intentionally create a blend of reading? Serendipity only goes so far. So if we do want to plan, how might we begin to do that?
So I mean, there's a number of ways to start. One of the good ways to start is to find one book that's on the subject and then see what they're connecting with. But the danger with that, and that is a useful tool, and it's certainly a tool we use when we encourage our students to use, and I'm sure many people watching will remember, when you're writing an essay or whatever, you kind of use that technique. The danger is that we can kind of remain within our own little theological bubbles when we do that. So part of the challenge is to try and find people who are writing from a different perspective, people who are going to disagree with us or with writer number one that we're starting with. That can be harder because we naturally gather around us people who agree with us, and we naturally connect with people who agree with us. But I think going out of our way to invite recommendations from others, that can help. So if you're looking at a particular question and you want to think hard about it, go to different publishers from normal. Publishers have their own particular kind of niches in the market. They have their own particular theological stances. If you're somebody who reads Zondervan and IVP a lot, then, I dare you to pick up a Banner of Truth book or a Day One Publications book. You may not agree with everything there, but it'll be very stimulating. And actually sometimes working out where we disagree or why we disagree, as well as finding maybe surprising areas of agreement. I think it can broaden our horizons. I'd also encourage us to read beyond dare I say, mere theology. I mean, theology is obviously hugely important and would never want to see that put down. But I think bringing other disciplines into the conversation, into the dialogue, learning from specialists in other fields can also be hugely enriching.
I mean, just to push it on that one a little bit, I mean, are there any principles, though, about how you might balance that? I'm thinking, for example, when we talk about Bible reading, then people will often say, well, always be in the Gospels regularly, perhaps always be looking at a psalm every time you go back to the Bible. So there are some foundational habits on top of which you might dip into Old Testament and the letters or whatever. I mean, do we take the same approach to theological reading? Are there some, I don't know whether you have your own sort of foundational reading, maybe going to certain things that are going to feed you, as well as introducing other aspects? Yeah,
and again, of course, it depends on people's personality types and their practices and how much time you have as well. I usually have about 5 or 6 books on the go at once, which won't suit everybody. So right now, for example, I've got an Advent read. So we're recording an Advent, if anyone's watching this later. I've got an Advent book I'm reading, 1 chapter a night. It's a poetry book. So that kind of touches a particular part of me, if you like. I've usually got a book. I try, because I'm an Old Testament specialist, I like to try and have an Old Testament book on the go. So I'm usually reading something. I'm in a book about the Old Testament, so I'm usually reading something about ancient Near Eastern world or Old Testament thought, or I've got one of those on the go, and then I'll have something else that's not explicitly theological on the go. So I'm personally very interested in kind of understanding society, social commentary, sort of veers into history, veers into politics. So I've usually got a book in that sort of area on the go, and maybe something else that's completely left field, unrelated, and maybe a novel as well, because actually I think that good novels make us think and explore. So I personally like to have, I think there is the name for the syndrome that of being killed by a pile of books falling upon you, but it may well happen to me one day.
I'm fascinated by the idea of sort of 5 books on the go at any one time. So do you take, again, an organised approach to how you read those? I mean, that sort of terrifies me, the thought of feeling responsible for getting through 5 books. I'd never quite know which to pick up in any one day. I mean, so do you approach that in any systematic way? Is it just, I think I'll read this one today? Or recognising everyone's different, of course.
Yeah, it's a bit systematic, I suppose. When I'm really in control of my diary, then I like to, so we have college prayers at 8:30 in term time and 9:00 outside term time. And, lockdown's proving a little bit more challenging. But, when I feel really in control of things, then I like to sit and read at least a chapter before morning prayers. And that's kind of my start is I've just cleared some space in my day to sit and read. I regard that as really important. and then my capacity to read beyond that is a little bit more dependent on diary constraints and so on. I really love reading, so I'll sit, if I have a quiet weekend day, I'll sit down with a cup of coffee and hopefully in a coffee shop and take a couple of books with me. So semi-planned, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm also wondering, while it's good to read outside of the echo chamber of the people that we agree with and to introduce other publishers or other points of view, I'm just thinking, what about other cultures? Because this year, for example, I know many ministers have been turning to some books that have reflected about racial justice on the back of the Black Lives Matter coming more to prominence recently. So how do we best read across cultures and move away from some of the places we always turn to again?
I think that's so important, and more universities and theological institutions are being encouraged to decolonize our curriculum. In other words, we are being invited to look at our reading lists and ask whether they are all written by white men, which quite often they scarily are. And so I think one of the chief things is actually being aware of the issue and noticing who's writing our books and consciously trying to go beyond that. How do we find those? So, there are a certain number of voices that are prominent and probably people have heard of. So Isa Macaulay is a big name at the moment. And Willie Jennings is someone who's written quite helpfully on some subjects who's a voice worth hearing on reading as a Black scholar. Anthony Reddy as well is another quite a big name. The Langham publishers publish. They have the Langham Partnership is very interested in its prime concern is for global scholarship. So if you want to find something from outside the sort of UK American echo chamber, it's worth going to Langham and seeing. So I haven't read it yet, but I've just acquired African Voices on the Old Testament or something, which I'm looking forward to reading. So that's a good place to look. And then linking on from there, seeing who Willie Jennings is talking about and who he's connecting with. Social media actually can be a really good way of making these connections sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I've got their sources of recommendation for reading. This is, I think, one of the problems that we might want to broaden our horizons. We might want to look into a certain theme. But where do we go for that? Where do we go for advice and wisdom? Any thoughts on that?
I think there's a whole load of different possibilities, and it's a good idea to employ a number of them. The colleges are here to help. I would always welcome an email from a ministerial colleague saying, I want to think about such and such, especially if it's in my area. Then obviously I'll give a considerable amount of time to thinking about answering that. And if not, I'll probably pass it on to a colleague who can answer it better. So we're here to make recommendations. And many of the colleges also, certainly in normal times, make the library available to local ministers as well. So, do feel free to avail yourselves of those opportunities. I like to invite recommendations from people who are, if I say people who are interesting, that implies that I categorize people into those who are interesting and those who are not interesting, and that I don't want to imply that. But the people who have interesting ideas, people who think interesting thoughts that I know, and I love to go to them and say, recommend a book to me. In fact, it's one of my things I do every summer is I contact a few people and say, suggest a book for me to take away this summer to read. And sometimes I hate the books they recommend, and that in itself can be a really interesting experience. And sometimes I just discover a whole new author, a whole new area that I'd never thought of. So that's serendipity, I suppose. That's inviting serendipity, and I think that's a great idea. And actually, also, even more intentionally, going to somebody that you disagree with. And actually within the Baptist family, we know ministers who take a very different stance from us on particular issues. Invite them to, in fact, I've just recently, he hasn't responded yet, but I'm hoping he will, invited someone I know who is really quite pro-Brexit and really quite right-wing, and I'm not, to suggest something for me to read so that I can understand why he thinks the way he does, even if he doesn't persuade me to his perspective. I think building bridges to understanding is hugely important.
Yeah. Just on the colleges, I'd want to also add in, because having talked to some of the other colleges, I know a few of our Baptist colleges offer, I suppose, what has usually been seen as a sabbatical package, and you can get some recommendations from a tutor and get access to the library and perhaps some tutor time later to help you reflect on what you've been reading. I suppose I know the colleges will want to say it's not just for sabbatical, that can be done at any time somebody wants to look into those topics. So I'm sure all the colleges would concur that they're happy to take emails and calls and help. What about kind of are there book review type journals or anything that you use or know of?
Yeah, I'm not very systematic about that, except when I'm doing a research project, then I have to be much more systematic. But there's the biblical, we've got the book review, Regents Reviews, which is a very good place to look. Andy Goodliff edits that. There's the Biblical Theology Bulletin, I think it's called, biblical views. I wasn't expecting this question. I should have been expecting this question, and I haven't come prepared with a list. But they do exist, and if you like, I don't know if you're able to, but I can find those out, and you can perhaps attach those to the recording.
Yeah, we can just put some text on the that will be attached to the recording a bit later on. No, that's great. I didn't forewarn you of the questions. My fault. I think I know some ministers certainly are using, they're kind of going to people's blogs or Twitter feeds or whatever, where they know they produce recommendations. And again, that balance between knowing where to go, where you're going to get fed because you by and large agree with that person's theological standpoint, and then also adding into that elements which are going to challenge you and be different.
More broadly, I also like to look at the Times Literary Supplement and the Guardian review of books as well. And I'm sure that some of the other papers do the same, and quite often, especially when I'm formulating my Christmas lists and things, I quite like to go through that and think, oh, that sounds like an interesting one. Yeah.
And so, I mean, Helen, presumably you're gaining a lot then from reading outside of the theology field. I mean, you said a bit about it earlier. What's the benefit for that in terms of our learning then and our general ministerial development?
Well, it's incalculable, actually, I think. I'm really firmly, and my students probably bored of hearing me say this, but I really firmly believe that all truth is God's truth, and that we can discover things that really matter, things that will help us to understand the world in books that are written that don't have God in mind. So, whether it's, well, for me, as I say, kind of history, politics, sociology, that sort of area, I'm learning things all the time that then come into dialogue for me with things I'm reading in the scriptures or things I'm reading in theological books.
Yeah.
I just think it makes us broader. I'll tell you a little story. This is from many years ago, and it wasn't within the Baptist family, but my husband and I had been going to a particular church for 2 years, and it wasn't really feeding us. We were quite struggling with it. But the thing that made us leave in the end was that the minister was preaching, I don't know, maybe he was preaching a psalm or something, and he referred to the stars, and he made a passing comment that the stars were just balls of fire circling the earth or something. I mean, it was something that was so bizarre and so self-evidently wrong. So afterwards, we were speaking to him, and we said, that's not right. The stars are suns, and they're millions of light years away. And he just said, oh yeah, whatever. And we just felt it was the final straw that broke the camel's back. But this minister had no credibility because he was so detached from the world. And so my husband and I joke that we may be the only people who ever left a church over incorrect cosmology. But do you know what I mean? There was such a disconnect with the real world there that I couldn't really respect his ministry anymore.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I guess that applies to so many things where we just need to be culturally on the case and a little bit up to date about what other people are thinking. And what about the internet? So some people are just not book people. They'll read, but they rarely pick up, printed text. And most of their resources are coming from the internet. Again, enormous field though. I mean, how do you choose wisely? And is it good actually to pick up a book from time to time? Should we be picking up books, or is it okay to be online all the time?
Ooh, well, you're asking a college tutor, aren't you? I think books are good, but
A biased reply is fine.
but I also think that there are some really good blogs out there, and some really good, not just reading resources. There are really good podcasts as well. So there are lots of places where we can be really stimulated, and it's finding the right ones, isn't it? It's finding the ones that are not balmy, you know. And I mean, I think most of us have got a pretty sensible antennae for balmy. Although I have to say the rise of conspiracy theory is making its way into the UK quite significantly. So we do need to be careful. And I think, again, it's probably looking for recommendations of people that we trust, not necessarily people who entirely agree with us, but people who are sensible and we trust, and seeing who they're reading and who they're recommending. And also, I mean, when I want to, perhaps I'm back to books again, but I think the principle applies more broadly. If I'm kind of trying to orientate myself with a book and I've just no idea where this is coming from and if this is going to be something that's going to be useful to me, I look on Amazon book reviews, because quite often you'll find, quite quickly you can find what people are saying about these books, and if it's balmy, then someone's going to flag that up. It's quite a quick way of working out whether a resource is useful or not. And there are similar things you can do with blogs. You can look at the comments and you can look at what other people are saying about blogs and podcasts, and if this is likely to be a useful resource or not.
We had a conversation last week, a number of people from across Baptist together, in what was called a sort of CMD collaboration, just trying to get together people who have got a heart for development and what might be made available nationally, I suppose. And there was an idea there about having a portal where people could go, ministers could go and have a bit of a one-stop shop for resources. It makes me wonder whether there needs to be almost a blog reading list. Again, a list of what's out there and what's people have found useful and why. I guess recommended by ministers. Maybe that's something we should look at, because I think increasingly people are turning to that as their source of information. Yeah.
And I think such things do exist. I think it'd be great to gather it, actually, but I think such things do exist. I'm thinking, for example, I reckon Stephen Holmes has done a list of blogs that he likes.
Okay.
And probably Andy Goodliffe has done something like that as well. So, there are some really sensible people within our denomination who are compiling this sort of thing. But I for sure, if we could collect that sort of thing centrally, it'd be great.
I think, well, I'll follow that one up and see whether we can get some information out there. What about those who do actually find it hard to read for more obvious reasons, such as dyslexia or just kids around all the time? And what are the options for theological learning, I suppose, or gaining information when, it's just hard to actually do the reading?
Well, I think we need to be, we've got all this wonderful technology at our fingertips now. So, I mean, podcasts are great, or can be great. Audiobooks are great. I usually have an audiobook on the go as well, which I listen to either when I'm driving or when I'm doing something boring like washing up or whatever, or sometimes if I can't sleep, I'll listen to it. I wouldn't like to tell the writer of the book that I'm using it to help me get to sleep, and I often have to backtrack and start again. So I think those things are useful. There are there are increasingly webinars and really useful resources online. Sermons. I mean, I go and look for sermons from respected people online and listen to those to feed myself. Not everybody is naturally a reader, and be blessed in finding blessing in all those other places as well, I would say.
I'm assuming that more substantial theological resources rarely get made into audiobooks, or is that not true?
Yeah, I haven't yet come across the kind of more weighty ones as audiobooks, I'm afraid. No.
Yeah, okay. Well, that may change over the years.
Speaking as well.
Yep.
And quite often you can find people giving a half-hour lecture or something, which gives the guts of a particular book or something. A shortcut to. Okay.
Just for those watching, I do want to encourage you to put your questions in the chat box, questions or comments. We'll come to those in a moment, but do put that in. But as we kind of wait for some of those to come in, I want to give Helen sort of contributor's privilege at the webinar, and just to say, Helen, give us something that you recommend right now. It's a moment in time, I realise, but if you want to say, here's one or two books that you think are just really great to read in 2020, going to 2021, what would they be?
Okay, I'm going to recommend 3 things. One I'm going to recommend actually is something called the Shelter Box Book Club, which I have joined since lockdown and I'm really enjoying. So Shelter Box is a charity that works for people in crisis across the world. And they've got this book club where you receive a book once every 6 weeks, and then there's the opportunity to engage with online and live kind of book club thing at the end of that 6-week period. And there's a choice of 3, and the book club community votes, and then so obviously you may or may not get the one you choose. And I really like that because it is making me read things that I would not have come across or have chosen. So some of the books I have received I have absolutely loved, and it's a mixture actually of fiction and non-fiction. So I'm reading at the moment, I'm reading a fictional account of a refugee family from Syria who are in Lebanon. So that's the one I'm reading at the moment. The one I read before was a book I think I would never have chosen, which was called, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was about an Iraqi chap who decides, who is transgender, and talks about his journey from kind of strict Islam through into the transgender role. And a whole range of things. And so I'm really enjoying that because it is dropping something on my doormat every month that I don't have control over. And so that's kind of making me think. So the 2 books I'm going to suggest, 2 very different ones. This is one of the best books I have read, I think, in this year. So this is called The Liberating Image by Richard Middleton. And Middleton is picking up on the image language, is exploring the image language from Scripture, particularly from Genesis 1, of course. And he explores, and you can see how keen I am on it, look at all those bookmarks in it. He explores how the Genesis account stands in such distinction to the other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. Now, that's fairly standard stuff, and many listeners will be familiar with that. But he takes it further and uses this image language to explore it in a really deep and very significant way, actually. So I really enjoyed that book recently. And the other book, completely differently, but if you've been reading about race and culture this summer and are interested, and if you're interested in things beyond the UK, then this was probably one of the best books I read last year. It's called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and she is looking at the way that in America slavery gave way to the Jim Crow laws, which effectively was effectively the same system by a different name almost. And then Jim Crow has given way to the war on drugs and black incarceration. And it really made me see things I had never seen before. So for those who are interested in that sort of thing, really eye-opening book. Those are my 2 top picks.
Okay, you heard it here first. Thank you very much for that. I guess one thing you're not really allowed to do is to advertise your own books. So I'm going to do that for you, Helen. I do want to just advertise your book that has just been published just a few months ago. The Bible Doesn't Tell Me So. And the subtitle here is Why You Don't Have to Submit to Domestic Abuse and Coercive Control. So I've just read this, and it's a guide really for anyone facing domestic abuse or supporting those who are, about how to apply the Bible's teaching and narrative to the subject of domestic abuse. And I want to say it's a very accessible book. You can read this as a pastor, but you could also give it to a congregation or community member. So Helen, thank you for writing it, a really good resource, and I do recommend that. So let's have a look and see. We haven't got a vast number of questions coming in or comments, but please do put them in. In fact, most of them are comments. So I'm just looking at Trevor Neal. Let me bring this up on the screen. Hi, Trevor. It says, worth mentioning that there are lots of best books of 2020 blogs at the moment. A very helpful list from Andrew Wilson at King's Church. So maybe this is a particular time of year where it's good to gather a few suggestions of what we might be reading. Tony Maud making a very good point here. Theological books may not be widely available in audio format, but history, culture books, etc. are often available. Just picking up on that idea of broadening our reading, not just theologically. And the danger of recommending something that I've not heard of, but from Minster Road Baptist Church, I can recommend Shelter Box Club 2. Awesome. We met the author as a bonus last time. So I will leave people to look into that and find out what it is. So do keep any questions or comments coming. If we've got some more, that would be helpful. Helen, I mean, one idea that you mentioned, the book club idea. I would love to see, of course, a combination of learning and the CMD habit of connection with other Baptist ministers coming together. So I've always met since I left college, however many years ago. I always meet twice a year with 3 of my college peers, and we most of the time do just catch up and pray for one another, talk about our emerging situation or evolving situation. But we have on occasion, only on occasion, chosen also to read something together, suggested by one of us, and then prepared for that day and come and discuss that book. Is that common, do you know, among ministers? Is that something you'd recommend?
I think it's a brilliant idea, and I think quite a few ministers do it. It's something that I'm trying to promote from my study centre as well. So yes, I think it's a great, and once again, you know, it's 3 or 4, however many different people. So somebody chooses a book that you may not have chosen. It may be a book you haven't heard of. And it's the discipline, actually, of sitting down and reading a book that isn't necessarily the one that you would choose to be reading, which can be hugely nourishing, I think. And then, you know, partly the accountability of then having to come back to your friends and confess if you haven't read it, but also, of course, the value of hearing one another reflecting on it. Yeah, I think it is done in little niches, but I think it's something to be promoted more widely.
Yeah, without wanting to become too rigid about it, but a little bit of a discipline that is brought by deadline is not a bad thing from time to time.
Yeah.
I find one of the advantages I've got at the moment is occasionally I'm being asked at the moment to review a book, which again just focuses the mindset to get it read and considered. Yes. Simon Robertson's just saying here, as a dyslexic himself, I use audiobooks all the time and some good stuff in there. So Simon, I don't know whether you could just, if you've got any ideas you want to put in the chat of where to go for looking for those, if there's anything specific to say. Helen, what about note-taking or summarising books? So I find it personally, this is just the way I'm wired, I don't really think until I write. And so if I read a book that I want to capture some of what it's saying, although it's a bit of a drag because it takes more time, I tend to write some sort of summary or quick review or chapter headings down, so I've got some memory when I come back to it without having to read the whole book, what it was I particularly learned from it. Again, any thoughts on that as a discipline or a practice? I
think it's a good idea. I think I read best with a pen in my hand, bizarrely, whether I'm using the pen or not. It's something where my brain's wired, I think. So I mark up, obviously, when I own them and only when I own them. This is why this one's so dogged, actually, because I don't own it. And so it's going to have to go back to the library. So it's only sticky. Yep. This one, on the other hand, I do own and is scored up all over the place. So I tend to scribble on the book as I read if it's mine. Sometimes I make a summary, just like a couple of sentences at the top of the chapter when I've read the chapter, so that I can quickly skim the book again and just remind myself what it contains. Obviously, sometimes I'll write up more or make more detailed notes, especially if it's something that I'm going to directly want to apply. The other thing that I occasionally do, either I've recently discovered it or it's recently appeared, I'm not sure which, but Word, the up-to-date versions of Word now has a dictate function. So sometimes when I kind of have got an idea in my head, or I've got I've just read a chapter and I kind of have got those ideas kind of just fizzing in my mind at the moment, I'll just switch on the dictate function and just splurge a paragraph about what that contains. And it's a very quick way of kind of communicating the gist of it without the discipline of having to kind of feel like you're writing an essay. So that's a technique that I use as well sometimes. Yeah, and also perhaps introducing that habit of attentiveness. If you journal, I find that this isn't a systematic way of recording what's in a book, but those things that particularly leap out for you, I find it very useful to put down in a journal. Again, I think it's the act of writing it tends to land it for me. Yes. So, the comments coming in. So, this is a question I've just asked, really. Do you have a systematic way of remembering what you read? You make notes. So I think what we're hearing is I encourage people to think about how they do, again, make the learning a more permanent feature. And then, Simon, thank you for coming back on this. So I've got an Audible account. Audible, I assume, is a thing. It is. An Apple website, whatever.
So it makes me download a book per month. So thank you for that recommendation. I'm just again looking at the comments. Okay, yeah, and then similar to your idea using Word, Helen, for sort of dictaphone, I use my phone to record sound notes. So yeah, and Alex here just commenting, I love reading books on leadership. And I guess, again, around particular themes, I'm sure there are lots of different places you can go to. On leadership, so for example, I've often used CPAS and their sort of stream on leadership. There's a leadership mailing you can sign up to from CPAS, which has a whole range of suggestions monthly on both Christian and broader aspects of leadership. So that's another place we can go to. That's
perhaps if we're waiting for some more to come in, can I just talk about Twitter for a minute?
Please.
Because I think Twitter is interesting. When it first emerged, I was very scathing about the idea that there could be anything meaningful in however many characters you're allowed. But actually, if there are people watching who don't use it and can stomach the idea of social media, for me, it is a place where I encounter ideas. I can follow people that I don't agree with, and I can I can get idea of currents of thought. And I do many of the ideas that are being kind of, that are in public discourse at the moment, I pick up on them first there, and then I can choose to follow them up in other ways. So for me, it's a way of keeping keeping tabs on ideas and the way people are thinking. And as I say, you can be very, very restricted. Of course, we can all be. These social media engines will naturally give us our own opinions back to us, will naturally show us people that are saying the same thing. But you can intentionally break that. You can go out of your way and listen to people who are different from you. I follow Donald Trump, not because I like him, but at least I know what he's saying.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's actually a very quick and easy way of gaining a broader set of opinions, because you can choose to follow certain people that will get your goat, but it's not bad to do. And likewise, again, to look at who you're following, I think, and think, well, as a white male, how many of these people are also white male, and how many are women, how many are black, how many are whatever, and to deliberately introduce some people to follow who come from a different cultural perspective. And it's fascinating. You see a whole conversation opening up that you just have no idea about.
Yes.
And that can be very useful. Just one really practical thing, Helen. Do you speed read? I mean, I'm a slow reader, which is a real pain. I mean, how do you get through stuff?
Oh, do you know, reading a chapter a day, if you can discipline yourself to read a chapter a day, it's surprising how quickly you can get through stuff, because it will come out as nearly a book a week, actually. And I set myself a challenge this year of trying to read a book a week. And so far I'm ahead of myself, which I'm quite pleased about. But I appreciate that I'm perhaps in a privileged position there. Do I speed read? I read faster than I ought to, actually. And sometimes I have to slow myself down when it's an important book or when it's a detailed book. That's partly why sometimes I'm not very good at reading novels these days, because I read too fast to appreciate them. So yes, I probably do speed read, but definitely a pencil in my hand will make me. And I do try and track an argument. I teach my students to sit there and work out the flow of this argument, and try not to just. Sometimes it's really easy when you read to. That idea of a dark thing with just a little beam of light that goes along, and sometimes we almost read like that, and we kind of forget what's gone before, and we don't know what's ahead, and we just we know what's happening in this moment, but trying to join it up, I think, is a really important thing to do.
Yeah, and the idea of reading a chapter a day, I think there may be no getting away from the D word, from the idea of discipline, to help us. I think if it's left to chance, or left to when we feel like it, I suspect, like many things in ministry, it does tend to fall off the edge of the table and not get done. That would be my experience, certainly. Yeah. Well, okay. I think probably we've seemed to have pretty much dried up on the comments and questions. But thank you to those who have introduced some ideas and some comments. I might see if I can draw some of those together in some PDF or some text that will go with the recording afterwards. So if you want to come back and have a look for that a bit later, then please do. Otherwise, I think for the moment, we'll probably draw it to a bit of a close. Helen, say massive thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. And before we say goodbye to Helen, I think it'd just be good to pray for us in our learning and our reading. So let me just do that. Father God, we give you thanks for the vast range of resources that are out there for us to learn. We thank you for those who are committed to thinking and writing and getting their thoughts and what your Spirit is saying to them out to a wider audience. Help us, Lord, to be wise consumers and to engage well with all that is out there. Help us to be supportive of one another with recommendations and guidance. Thank you particularly within the Baptist family for the work of the colleges and some of the individuals who are providing theological direction for others. Lord, may we become better at this, better at gaining resources and learning, listening to what you're saying to culture and to the church through these resources. We pray for your Spirit's help in these matters in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Helen, thank you, and we will see you soon. Before I go, just again a quick reminder of next month's webinar, which is the 13th of January, looking at the topic of how to make the most of a 360-degree review, which is a way of reviewing our ministry. Really do recommend you come to that one and watch it. It's quite important for our CMD. But I think otherwise that's it. And so from me, it's just to say God bless you. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.